Welcome to our overview of the perfect tense in Greek. A question that we can ask ourselves as we begin thinking about the function of the perfect tense is, what's the difference between the aorist and the perfect? In some languages of the world, the difference between these two tenses has basically been blurred so that they're virtually not distinct. The perfect, we could say, I have spoken with the doctor, whereas the aorist equivalent in English would be, I spoke with the doctor. Both of these denote past action. The difference would be in the provision of have, or in some instances, the helping verb has, in the perfect translation. The perfect denotes an action whose effects are felt at least up to the moment of speaking or writing, and this is a feature that's suggested by the helping verb have or has. The aorist denotes simple or undefined action that generally occurred in the past. So both of them have to do with past action, but the difference is the perfect emphasizes the present effects or the present implications of whatever that past action was. So let's talk about the formation of the perfect tense in Greek. This is maybe the second or third tense formative that we've met so far this year. The tense formative is kappa alpha. We recently met sigma alpha, which is the aorist tense formative. Well, now we're meeting kappa alpha, and the perfect is going to take the primary endings. So we've learned two sets of endings, the primary and the secondary. This might seem a little funny because if we think, well, the perfect, that's actually a past action. Shouldn't it take those secondary endings, just like the other two past tenses take? Well, maybe it seems like it should, but perhaps because it focuses more on the present implications of whatever that past action was, it's going to take the primary endings. So kappa alpha plus the primary endings is how it forms. And it also has a new feature called reduplication. Let's take a look at how this looks on a verb like luo. Reduplication just means that it takes the first letter, if it's a consonant, of a word, and it reduplicates at the front of the word and adds the vowel epsilon. So the reduplication of lu would be le. Le-lu plus the tense formative, and then we have the primary ending, men, first plural, primary ending, and lelukamen. That would mean we have loosed. So let's talk about the forms here. The first singular would form leluka. So technically it doesn't have an ending. If we go through our primary endings, luo, lues, lue, and so on, well, luo has that omega ending, but technically that's the lengthening of the connecting vowel because there is technically no ending in the first singular. So this just ends with the tense formative ka. Leluka, I have loosed. Leluka has that sigma ending, you have loosed. Leluken. So here the alpha shifts to an epsilon. We saw the same thing happen in the third singular for the aorist. It's kappa epsilon this time. He has loosed. And that will help us distinguish between the third singular and the third plural, because some third plural forms, as we're going to see in a second, have kappa alpha nu. So the third singular has the ken instead of the kon. Then we've got lelukamen, which would mean we have loosed. Lelukate, you have loosed, and lelukasin, they have loosed. There is an alternate ending, lelukan, and that also means they have loosed, and sometimes you'll see it written both ways, or you'll see the both possible endings in the Greek New Testament. The middle passive form does not use a tense formative, and so in our translations here, ben is added to the passive translation. Sometimes in the context they might be more middle, but generally they'll be passive, and we can include the passive helping verb ben. So let's take a look at these. Lelumai. So we've got the reduplication plus the stem of the word plus the primary middle passive ending. The translation of this would be I have been loosed. Or lelusai. In some of the other forms of verbs that we've learned, we see that the psi normally contracts. Well, in the perfect middle passive voice, it doesn't, and you see the whole ending. This would be you have been loosed. Lelutai, he has been loosed. Lelumetha, we have been loosed. Leluste, you have been loosed. And then leluntai, they have been loosed. So to review, if we go back to the active voice column, we've got the reduplication plus the stem of the verb plus the tense formative plus the primary verbal endings. And for the middle passive voice, we are going to keep the reduplication. Then we see the stem of the verb, and there's no connecting vowel, there's no tense formative. It takes directly to the stem. Are going to be attached these middle passive primary endings. So let's take a look at this perfect verb in action. 1 John 4:16 says, "And we have known and have believed the love that God has for us." Or we could say, "And we have known and believed the love that God has for us." Egnokamen and pepistukamen are our two perfect verbs, and they're active in this context. The first one might throw us off a little bit because we should be able to identify, okay, it looks like it comes from ginosko, but the stem does form directly from the root, as will often happen with forms of ginosko. But what happened there at the front? Because it looks like it has an augment and not reduplication, right? We should be able to see the kappa alpha. Okay, that's perfect. But what about that epsilon right there? What does that mean? Well, this is called vocalic reduplication, and it's fairly common because verbs that begin with two consonants are fairly common. And so if a verb like ginosko, and its stem here in the perfect begins with gamma and nu, it's going to take an epsilon instead of somehow reduplicate. That's something to keep in mind. If that's a little bit of a struggle for you, there's some other features that can help you remember that it's perfect. And it's applied after the preposition at the beginning of compound verbs. If we see a compound verb in context, let's just say it was from apostello, and the perfect form would be apestalka. What happens is that after the prepositional part of the word, this is actually apostelka forms from apa and stel. Apa is the preposition. The reduplication looks a little more like augmentation, and it's going to happen right after the prepositional part of the word. That's really similar to some of the rules that we learned for augmentation. But something to keep in mind when we're trying to identify these perfect verbs. Here's another one. And he said to him, "Your faith has saved you." So sesoken is the verb that we've translated has saved here. And again, we should be able to take a quick glance and say, okay, it looks like it's from sozo. I see the reduplication. I see the kappa in there. The epsilon means it's third singular. Okay, and so we begin the process of deduction, but we notice that, but wait a second, what happened to the delta? Or if it kept the present tense stem, the zeta. Well, but what happened to the stem of sod? Well, sometimes a verb loses the final letter of its stem. And that letter is going to be absorbed, if you will, by the first letter of the tense formative. And that's what's happening here with sodso. It dropped its final stem letter, and it doesn't really, it's not pronounced well, or even if it was pronounced, it would either be awkward or nearly silent, sedsoken, and so it just ends up being sesoken. Here's another example from John chapter 18. Jesus is speaking, and he said, "You are saying that I am a king. For this reason I have been born, and for this reason I have come into the world." So there's two perfect verbs here, gegenemai and elelutha. Gegenemai comes from genao, and the stem or the root is gena, and the alpha has actually lengthened to an eta. It's still recognizable, but it's just a little shift that we're going to see pretty often with these perfect verbs, that often before the ending there will be a vowel that lengthens. And if there's any question, you can always look it up in the lexicon. Elelutha comes from erkomai, and it's one of these verbs whose stem changes or root changes as it goes from tense to tense to tense. And instead of a kappa alpha, it takes just an alpha. Do you see that? Elelutha. It's not eleluthka, it's elelutha. That happens with a number of verbs in the Greek New Testament. Here's just a quick list for your reference. Akekoa is one, comes from akuo, and it means I have heard or I have learned. Gegona comes from genomai, and it just has an alpha in the perfect tense. I have been or I have become. Gegrafa is another one. It would mean I have written. Elelutha, I have come, or I have gone. And Elepha would be I have taken, or I have received. That is a fairly common phenomena where the kappa alpha shifts to just an alpha. It's a series of verbs in which that happens, but these are the ones that are most common. So here's all of the tenses. I want to congratulate you that if you've been following in this course, we have looked at and we've studied all of the different, the 5 indicative tenses: present, imperfect, perfect, future, and aorist. And here's a little chart that you can use to maybe review the different tenses we've seen to this point if you want to pause the video and see how well you remember them. There's a little note at the bottom of the first 3 tenses that remember the present, imperfect, and perfect share the same forms in the middle and the passive voices. And so we haven't listed out them separately. The context is actually what distinguishes them. The future and aorist do have separate formations, and so those have been listed separately. The present tense is pretty straightforward. It's the stem plus the connecting vowel plus the primary endings. The imperfect, that's going to form with the augment, with the stem taken directly from the present tense, so those stems will always look the same, plus the connecting vowel plus the secondary endings. The perfect has what distinguishes that tense is the reduplication, the stem, and then the tense formative, plus the primary endings. And then we've got the future. There's the difference of the sigma tense formative, and down in the future passive, the theta, eta, sigma is going to distinguish that voice. And we've got the aorist. The aorist is going to take the augment. It's going to take the aorist tense stem. And then normally it's going to take the sigma alpha. We also studied second aorists that form directly from the root, and they're a lot like the imperfect. The only thing that makes them different is that they form from the root rather than the present tense stem. But most aorists are going to have the sigma alpha tense formative, and they're going to take the secondary endings as well. The aorist passive down below here is going to be marked by the theta eta tense formative, and it actually takes the secondary active endings. I know that's a lot of information, but the more comfortable you become with this chart, the more comfortable you're going to be moving fairly quickly through the translations.